love begins to free you, you look back on that mess and it makes you wonder what it was that hypnotized you, what was it that mesmerized you, that you didn't see it sooner. Let me drop way down to verse 33. Jesus called these guys that did all of this, he said, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of Gehenna, that garbage dump? How can you escape the condemnation that's going to come on you when you are cast in that garbage dump that is a fire that burns with decaying animals and bodies, where maggots and worms are consuming that dead flesh," which was going to be the future of the Jews when Rome came through in 70 AD and began to totally overrun the capital and destroy the temple. Therefore, he says in verse 34, "Therefore indeed I send you prophets, I send you wise men and scribes. Some of them you'll kill and crucify, and some of them you'll scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city." Jesus always saved his best barrage of angry words for religious leaders who absolutely knew what they were doing. And when somebody begins to rock the system, Jesus said in verse 34, "I'm sending you people that will warn you, try to get you turned around, try to open your eyes, try to shake you out of this." But he said, you don't receive them. And he said, some you'll crucify and some you'll scourge. And the same thing goes on today. Here's what they did when somebody shook the boat, and here's still what religion does to those of us that are shaking the boat today. They crucify you, they scourge you, they set you apart, they do whatever they can to distance you. This verses 4 through 6, Jesus lays out not only the motivation of what religion is all about, he exposes the hierarchical hypocrisy to the bone. He says they lay heavy burdens on you, but they themselves will do nothing. And the reason they lay heavy burdens on you is to control you. If I can lay down enough laws and rules and regulations and convince you that you must keep them to please God, to be accepted in His eyes, I then can begin to hammer you every week. And a lot of us came out of a weekly hammering by the pastor. And some of us, look how perverse this is. Some of us would even go to the pastor after the service and say, "Pastor, that was a wonderful sermon. You stepped all over my toes. You sure hit me today. You hit me right between the eyes. You just got all over my business today. You got all over my case today." It was like we're saying, beat me again, beat me again. I love it so much. And we went in every week and got our beating. And we loved it. Some people loved it. Back in the day when I used to really hammer on stuff, I would have people come and say, "That was the best sermon I ever heard. You just beat me to a smithereen. You just beat the stuffing out of me." And they had a big old smile on their face like they really enjoyed the beating. That's the hierarchical hypocrisy of this. They tell you what to do, but they themselves don't keep the standard or the level. They have giant egos and motivation to be seen and to be praised. They love Jesus lays it out in what is it, verse 7? He says, verse 6, they love the best places to feast and the best seats in the synagogue. Have you ever been a part of a charismatic church where the special speakers don't come in during praise and worship? They're back somewhere else, hidden off. And once the service is going, here comes the procession. Here comes the armor bearers carrying the man's Bible, like he doesn't have enough strength to carry his own Bible. And where are they brought? Are they taken to the back row? No, they love the best seats. They're brought straight down in the front so everybody can see them. It's a big deal. It's a procession. They love the best front row seats. They're ushered in by armor bearers after the service starts. Back in the day, I used to have speakers tell me, let's just stay in the office till about 30 minutes into praise and worship, and then we'll go into the service. Well, why don't we just go in and praise and worship with everybody else? They love public recognition and titles. There are titles today coming up I've never heard of in all my life. I've got Facebook friends now that aren't just claiming to be bishops. They're not Catholic, but they are archbishops. Oh yeah. I have friends that are not now just prophets, they're master prophets. And I've got apostle friends that are no longer just satisfied with being an apostle, they are chief apostles. Jesus just unwinds this whole system. And when you're in it, either you don't recognize it or you just think this is the way this whole thing rolls. And I think probably in Jesus' day, they were in the same situation. All right, now here's where I wanted to go. I've said all that to say this. In verses 8, 9, and 10, Jesus sets the house in order. First 7 verses, he lays bare to the bone and exposes the hypocrisy of not only religion, but the motivation of religious leaders. Now watch how he starts verse 10. He said, but you followers and you that are in the public, that's who he's talking to, do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you're all brethren. Verse 9, do not call anyone on the earth your father, for one is your Father, which is in heaven. All right, now verse 10. And don't be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. Wow, now watch, he's taking a dramatic shift. You see what he's done? The first 7 verses, he exposes religion, religious leaders. He exposes the burdens, the laws, the regulations that have been placed on you. Then in verse 8, to his disciples and to the public, he says, I can bet Jesus was wagging his finger. Don't any of you ever be called rabbi. In other words, don't get mixed up or strive to become involved in that system. Stay clear of it. Now, he goes on to say in verse 10, he said, you've got one teacher, and that's Christ. Now, I want to ask you a question. There's one teacher. Don't call anybody teacher. You got one teacher, which is in Christ. Now, I want to ask you something. This is a huge difference between what you've encountered in the grace and the finished work inclusion message than what you had in your charismatic, Pentecostal, Baptist, evangelical days. Religion would never release you to be taught by Christ directly. What's going on today is that the Spirit of truth teaching people directly. Whatever it is that you came out of would tell you that you need the rabbi. You need the pastor. You need the prophet to teach you and give you direction. Jesus said, I'm releasing you to know that there's only one teacher you got, and that's the Christ. Think back now in your religious days. Were you ever encouraged or pushed at all to learn directly from Jesus or from the Spirit of truth? Or were you always tied to a system and to the rabbi, the superstars of that system, to get your information? Why do you think thousands of people, nothing against Kenneth Copeland or Believers conventions, I've been to many of them, but they would flock to those conventions to hear what Kenneth Copeland, Jerry Savelle, whoever this list of speakers were, speak, and they brought some great teaching. I'm not saying that. But most of the people that came to those were not tuned in to hear for themselves. They were there to hear what somebody else said and then embrace it as the truth. And Jesus is teaching, he's weaning us off of that. Does that mean I don't listen to people? No, I listen to YouTube, I listen to teaching, I read books. I'm wide open, but listen to me. I know that ultimately there is one that reveals truth to me, and it's the Christ. In verse 8, he just levels the playing field. He says, don't call anybody rabbi, and here he levels the field, because you're all brethren. There is nobody that has a leg up on anybody. All right? Now, I want you to get this down, because where we're going in embracing your divinity, you got to see this. Nobody has a leg up on anybody. We are all brethren. There's no hierarchy. There is none of this nonsense of you need a covering from some man in order to function, telling you what you can do and what you can't do. Then in verse 9, he throws a wrench in the whole thing. Now watch verse 9. He throws a wrench in there and he pops in a mind-blowing truth that the church still fights today. And this is why religion has ingrained us to where it's hard, even for some of us that are listening here in the Digital Cathedral. I had one lady that is really into grace and she has great understanding. She told me this week, she said, when you announced that title, I struggled with it. And she said, I realized it was because of how deep the claws of religion really had a hold of me. And this is a lady that's very mature, great lady. But this is the mind-blowing truth. Now look at this in verse 9. He says, don't call anyone on earth your father. Now this is going to get deep. For one is your father, he who is in heaven. Now, talking about embracing your lineage there. He said, don't call any man on earth your father. Now, Jesus isn't disrespecting your earthly parents. Get that straight. He's not telling you don't disrespect them. Jesus was all in agreement with showing respect to mothers and fathers. He demonstrated that when he was on the cross. He looked at the apostle John and said, John, I'm going to paraphrase it. He said, John, I want you to take care of my mother the rest of her life. And he said, Mom, I want you to see John. There's your new son right there. He's going to take care of you. All right? So Jesus made sure his mom was taken care of. So Jesus wasn't saying disrespect your parents. What he was saying, what he was talking about, when he said, don't call any man father, small f, for you have one Father, capital F, which is in heaven. He's talking about your source of being. He's talking about the point of your origination. He's talking about the giver of your life. Whose life is it that flows through your veins really? He's talking about family connection. When we talk about embracing your divinity, we're talking about embracing your point of origination and not seeing yourself lesser than your Father which is in heaven. Now, I respect my earthly father. Always did. Love my earthly father. But I never saw my earthly father as greater than me. I saw us as one together. We were bone of bone, blood of blood. I mean, we're family, right? And what he's trying to get across to us is that you have the same stuff making you up that makes the Father up. You have the same DNA. You are eternal spirit. You always existed and you always will exist. You are eternal spirit. You are irrevocably, eternally one with your source.